Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/233, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello everybody, and welcome to the 233rd edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thank you so much for joining. I'm sitting here in a frigid tundra like so many of you are in the States right now if you're listening to this, and close in real time to when I'm recording. Thoughts to all of you if you are in Texas and other places that are not used to this kind of weather, because you're dealing with stuff and things, and hopefully you're utilizing your camping gear maybe to help get you through it. It's a thing. It's a mess. And I hope everybody's doing okay. Up here in my neck of the woods, we are preparing for yet another big snowstorm. And I actually brought, because I was in DC temporarily to help Kimberly out with some appointments, I've got my trainer now here. So despite the fact that I'm not able to ride that much, I'm actually going to hook the touring bike up to this trainer and maybe go for a little pseudo ride, I guess we'll call it. We're going to give that a shot. I don't know if I'll talk about it on the podcast, but we may give it a shot. On this edition of the Pedal Shift Project, we are, I don't know how else to call this. This is the randomly stuffed pannier episode. I have just sort of odds and ends on my mind, including follow-ups and a suggestion for some Black History Month learning with a bike touring twist. Consider this just like sort of when your pannier mid-tour has just a lot of things going on in it. That's what this episode is all about. So let's start off. Let's kick it all off. These are going to be a series of follow-ups on past episodes, and I've been hearing from a bunch of you. I wanted to make sure that I got in touch. If you let me know about White's Ferry in the most recent week or so, you are in good company. I got a lot of emails. I got a lot of social media links to a variety of different articles. I've got a link into the show notes to the Washington Post article. Hey, guess what? White's Ferry has a chance after all. If you are not familiar with the scenario, you did not listen to the episode on closures and detours from the last time. A variety of different closures and detours I had highlighted. I got lots of information, new follow-ups on that. So White's Ferry, if you didn't know, had been around for over 200 years. It's a cable ferry that crosses the Potomac River. The folks on the Virginia side said no more and got the courts involved. And so the ferry's closed, and it was looking pretty bad as of the last episode. And now, there's a chance. There's a guy who owns a moving company locally who, if you're in the DC area, it's JK Moving, which is not to be confused with JK Wedding Dance, which was, I think, one of the first major YouTube videos that went viral. Go Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's funny, and apparently they're still together. Anyways, that's a tangent. There is a new owner of the ferry, JK Moving guy, and this guy is actively negotiating with the Virginia landowners to try to figure out a way to get that ferry up and running again. Don't know if it's going to happen. It's as I said in past episodes, you would think that this is just kind of a number on a piece of paper and they would be able to figure it out. But maybe a new owner will help make it, because it seems that it got personal over time. The interesting thing about it, and you can, again, read the article in the show notes. The interesting thing is that the new owner also purchased the, the snack bar, I'll call it. There was a building next to the ferry, and occasionally it was open, and occasionally you could get food there. And occasionally I got something. Usually I just went to the vending machines outside because frankly, it was closed more than it was open. It will be interesting to see whether or not the new owners actually do something with it and actually staff it and have it open, because it is a very convenient spot to get actual food if it's open for those of you who are touring. So fingers crossed, maybe this is a thing. Maybe we'll have a ferry for those of you who have hotel bookings. I think that if I were a betting man, which I am not, I would say I would be kind of stunned if this doesn't end up working out. Again, it's a business thing. It's money. Someone's going to figure this out. So hopefully the new owner will make that all happen. I suspect that the JK Moving guy, if he didn't think that he could make the deal happen, he wouldn't have bought it in the first place. So anyways, White's Ferry, follow up. You're saying there's a chance. One other thing that I wanted to mention about closures with the C&O trail is something that I'd completely forgotten about. And our friend of the show, Preston Page Piper, the Triple P, has been the guy on top of this for years. The Paw Paw Tunnel. I have been very lucky. There has been an ongoing closure off and on with the Paw Paw Tunnel because they're doing a complete descaling project. And what's that? It's a fancy way of saying they're trying to make it so that rocks don't fall on you on the DC side of the tunnel. Because if you've ever been there or if you've ever seen pictures, they're sheer cliffs. And man, rocks love coming down it. And so the National Park Service thought, it would be a bad thing if rocks hit people. So we're going to fix that. Turns out it takes years and years to do. So where we're at right now, and I've got a link in the show notes to the whole Paw Paw Tunnel closure page. And I will update my C&O guide on over. It's pedalshift.net/Cando, C&O. The deal is this. The tunnel is open, but the trail on the DC side of it, the downstream side, that's closed. Okay, so you can go through the tunnel as long as you're coming through the Cumberland side of things. Here's the deal. If you're coming from the DC side and you're riding to Cumberland, you can go up and over the trail, up and over the trail, up and over the tunnel, and then go through the tunnel on the other side and then turn around and come back. So you will still be able to get the Paw Paw Tunnel experience, which I think you really should do if you're riding. The downside is no matter which way you're coming from, because the downstream trail is closed, that means that you're going to have to go up and over. And Preston has got a great video that I think I've linked in the show notes a million times, showing how to do that bypass trail. My first tour of the year, which I'm hoping to do in the next month or so, when all of the snow melts, someday it'll melt, I'm going to do a ride from here at the cabin to Cumberland, or at least to the Paw Paw Tunnel, and I'm going to try to get some eyes on that trail, and then also maybe do a video to help supplement what Preston's done for a more recent look at it. I believe his video is a couple years old. I'm sure it hasn't changed that much, but it's definitely worth checking out. So link in the show notes to the Paw Paw Tunnel closure. Dealing with that is going to be something you're going to have to factor in if you're going to be doing a through ride of the C&O and indeed also the Gap. It's going to take you probably an extra hour compared to what it would normally be just going through the tunnel. But you will at least be able to get the tunnel experience if you've never done it before. Hoisting a fully loaded bike up that thing is going to be a thing. So, if you can ride a little bit lighter, that would be something that I would recommend. It's certainly something I'm going to be doing. Last but not least, as part of the follow-up on the closures and detours episode from last time, Highway 1. A variety of articles. Nothing really new that's worth linking to, but the deal is this. The road is still closed. They keep shrinking the area that's impacted. CalTrans is on it, but unfortunately, they don't have a timeline on the opening of this. So if you've got your eye on a spring tour on the Pacific Coast, and that includes Big Sur, which it should because it's gorgeous, it's amazing. There's no timeline on that opening yet. So hopefully there's going to be an opening for bike touring's sake, but more so for the folks who are local. There was an anecdote in one of the articles I read, one of the TV stations, I think it was, that had a piece. And there was a person who worked in one of the restaurants in Big Sur. They live south of where the outage is. And instead of doing a 4.5 hour extra drive, that's how long the detour is. That person is actually working or living in Big Sur, or like staying in Big Sur for the week, so they don't have to do that 4.5 hour detour every single time. So it's a thing. And hopefully they'll reopen it. So that's it for follow-up on closures and detours. Now, a follow-up on the bike packing setup episode that I did a few episodes ago. This one's a pretty short one, but it's short and smart because friend of the show, Reinhart Bigl, who also is a Pedal Shift Society member, he told me, he said something that actually I really should have thought about. I don't know why I didn't. I should have thought about it. And he was the one that kind of came up with the whole idea. And that is this. What if I, instead of thinking about new bikes or whatever, what if maybe you just replace that fork? If you remember, I got the bike repaired and they put on a fork without brazons. And so I think that overall, I think that's a good idea, come to think of it. So it would be a small investment in terms of an overall repair to the bike. Yeah, and maybe I could, donate or sell this fork, which is a perfectly good fork that's barely been ridden on altogether, but, replacing it with a fork with brazons on it so I can get those fork cages. That might be something that I end up thinking about, perhaps as early as the spring. What I do need to do is I need to call my favored bike shop in DC and see what they're looking at in terms of all of it. So I'm gonna look into that, see what Bicycle Space can do if they've got availability. And actually, I may want to consider doing that sooner rather than later. So that's a follow-up that I'm going to be doing, and more on that. Thank you, Reinhart, for that incredibly smart, perhaps should have been more obvious to me, solution to the bikepacking setup episode. All right, so now I've got a follow-up on the route scouting trip. That, for those of you who did not listen to the past episode, was a spring tour, I think. I think it's going to be the first big tour of the year, and this is going to be from here in West Virginia at the cabin to probably New York City, maybe just to Philly, but probably New York City. The interesting part about that episode was they was scouting basically day one. That gets me past the C&O and then basically up Highway 11 in Maryland and then across into Pennsylvania. Interesting, I've got a couple of folks who live in the nearby area and were able to give me some really good advice as to the Pennsylvania side of things. So friend of the show, Todd Grossbeck, brings some knowledge. He mentions a couple of things. First, that there's a short rail trail through Chambersburg, which is that last town that I was talking about there, where Highway 11 transitions to Highway 30. And I confirmed that that rail trail could be really helpful for portions of Highway 11 as you get into town. So that's really good. He also notes that there's a fair amount of Amish folks who are typically on bikes north of Chambersburg. So there is a sense from locals that they're going to be seeing bicycles on Highway 11 there. So that's a really helpful bit of information as well. That's, of course, true in all sorts of parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and indeed everywhere around Amish country. There's folks on bikes and people are used to seeing them, and often the roads accommodate for all of that and the drivers are used to seeing it. Therefore, they're used to giving plenty of room, which I think is really helpful. He confirms, Todd does, that 30 east out of Chambersburg is about as rough as I thought it was going to be. The shoulder isn't there for a good chunk of that. Drivers are perhaps maybe not so hot in that area, and the shoulder doesn't come back until basically one full town over to the east, and that's Fayetteville. The one nice thing that Todd mentions is something that I think I was somewhat aware of, but hadn't gone that far because it's probably where I would be spending the first night potentially if I was camping. Caledonia State Park is right off of Highway 30, and indeed, if memory serves, that's where the Pennsylvania bicycle route splits off from Highway 30. I could stay on Highway 30, but if I wanted to follow the bicycle highway route, that would be the way to go. And he says that the park is beautiful. So Todd, thank you for all of that. That's really good stuff and very helpful for sort of framing how the end of that first day would go. Rock William 2 from the Gmail also got in touch with me as well. And he says, I just listened to your podcast about the DC to New York trip. I live in Mont Alto, Pennsylvania, and frequently bike on both Route 11 and Route 30. I'm sure you've seen this, but if not, Maryland 63 might be a less traveled route that would still support bikes. By using this, you could go from Williamsport, Maryland, and connect with Route 11 outside of Greencastle, Pennsylvania. Greencastle was a town that I traveled through by car in that episode. He says this route is mostly rural and avoids riding through the center of Hagerstown. That's a really interesting option. I may take a look at that. In fact, actually, when William, I'm going to assume your first name is William, and if not, well then, I apologize. I'm just going by your email handle. In any event, I think that's interesting. It looked like the Google Street View, there was not much of a shoulder on that route, which may not be a big deal, but it's a trade-off of riding through Hagerstown, which did seem kind of busy. So I'll have to take a closer look at that and decide whether or not I want to do that. One thing I'll say about going through Hagerstown is that it's a great place to get lunch. And depending on how long of a ride or how early I start in the morning, which would probably be pretty early, that timing may actually work out a little bit better for me. So I'm going to take a look at that Maryland 63 option though, just to kind of see what's going on. That's it for that particular episode, which I thought was actually kind of, I was surprised at how much feedback I got. I think that there's a lot of folks who live in this sort of neck of the woods who listen to the show. So thanks for listening. And here's somebody who does not live anywhere near me. And this is Scott Gilbert from Hawaii. I always love folks from Hawaii because they always say aloha to me. Aloha Tim, Scott starts. He says, have enjoyed, by the way, this is all about Brompton riding, little clown bike love. Have enjoyed your show and tales of adventure for a few years, especially the fables and foibles of your Brompton upgrades and travels. I ride a bike Friday as far as I can. 2020 limited me to an island in the Pacific. Thought you might like to read a couple that rode from Greenwich and back on their folders. And when Scott says to Greenwich and back, he's talking about around the world, starting and ending in Greenwich on their folding bikes. Great pictures too. He says, don't let anyone say Brompton can't compete with the big wheelers. And he's got a link to a Facebook group, or at least a post within the Facebook group that talks about this trip. And my favorite picture in the whole thing was actually them at the Avenue of the Giants in California, which is, of course, one of my favorite places in the world to bicycle. But more importantly, one of my favorite campgrounds, the Burlington campground, really close to there. They were rocking trailers with their folders. And I think it just looked really interesting. And of course, you just think about the utility and the amazing capability of folding bikes and what they're capable of doing. And of course, their trip really, really underscores all that. Scott, thank you so much for sharing that. And aloha and mahalo to you, sir. I want to get to Hawaii one of these days. It's been way too long, like 30 years too long. All right. Last but not least on this stuffed pannier episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I do every February. So February, as many of you know, is Black History Month here in the States. I wonder if it's Black History Month elsewhere. I certainly know it's true in the States. One of the things that I do, just as a bit of personal edification and personal learning, is I try to learn something new about Black history every February. Part of that is because, frankly, it's, in my lifetime, it was very much underserved. My history books did not tell the story of Black people beyond slavery for the most part. And frankly, that really, as you can probably tell, underserves everything. And so my little bit of learning, which I try to learn a little bit on every topic all the time, but in February in particular, I try to learn something about Black history. And two things that I did. The biggest thing that is relevant for this show is that I ran into a story that I'm surprised I hadn't run into before. And that is the story of the 25th Infantry and their bicycle trip from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri back in 1897. So the 25th Infantry was made up of entirely, in terms of the soldiers, Black soldiers. Now, the officers that were in charge of it were white, but they were most famously called the Buffalo Soldiers. It might be a name that you were familiar with if you had any kind of background in military history or anything along those lines. I don't happen to have a lot of background in all of that, but this really caught my eye. So the 25th Infantry undertook this trip. Well, let me start off. Let's talk about the trip first. It's 2,000 miles long between Missoula, Montana, where they were stationed, to St. Louis. And these bikes were barely a couple of years or a few years into the safety bicycle boom. So these are your typical, the types of bikes that we ride right now, except they were about 60 pounds a piece, all steel. And they had steel wheels as well. So this was pre-pneumatic tires, averaging about 60 miles per day. Now, these folks, the Black Infantry, were volunteered, and I say that specifically. They were told to do this. They were ordered to do this, to test out a theory that the bicycle would replace the horse in transporting Army personnel from place to place. And it was a working theory. The bicycle, if you can remember back to the episodes that I did about Annie Londonderry, the New Woman episode that I did way, way, way back. And I think I've done it as in fact, it's been rebroadcast as a best of. That was the time when the bicycle was just sweeping the nation. I mean, people were crazy in the US about bikes. And so people who really got into it, think of it, the bicycle at that time was sort of like the high-end technology of the day. So people who were into tech then were like really big into trying to evangelize using it for all sorts of things. And some of them were in the army, and some of them decided, hey, let's get the black infantry unit to go do an insane ride. 2,000 miles on steel tires up. And they didn't do this, by the way, over nice paved roads. They didn't exist in the West back then. This 25th Infantry was specifically tasked with going up and over mountains, through rough terrain, and it was a hot mess. I wanted to point you to a couple of different resources because I think it's worth checking out for a variety of reasons. It's a fascinating look at, first of all, an amazing feat that these black soldiers accomplished, despite all of the obstacles that were in their place. And I say that not just the physical obstacles, but the societal obstacles before them as well. So really interesting stuff. Two things that I would point you to. One I have seen, one I intend to read. And the first is the documentary that I've seen. It's an hour long, really well done by PBS. It's called Bicycle Corps, America's Black Army on Wheels. And I've got a link in the show notes to that. You can check that out. I think you can do it for free. I happen to be a PBS member, or a member of my local PBS affiliate. So I think you should be able to watch that, at least here in the States. If you can't see that internationally, let me know, because I've got another option for you, and that is a book that I think I'm going to get because this was so interesting to me. It's called The Great Bicycle Experiment: The Army's Historic Black Bicycle Corps, 1896 to 1897. And I've got a link to Amazon, but I'm sure that you can get it through your independent bookseller as well. So check both of those out. Really, really fascinating bit of history as well. And spoiler alert, they made it. And there was a big parade essentially in St. Louis for them when they came in. But ironically, perhaps when all was said and done on both ends, these soldiers, despite the fact that they were protecting Missoula in kind of the wild, wild west times, were, celebrated for what they were doing. But at the same time, they were, of course, subject to overt racism. And same is true on the St. Louis side of things. And that's part of the story. And I think that's important to read about and to watch either on the PBS documentary or in that particular book. So I was really interested in that. I'm curious if there's any other stories about from a Black history perspective or from bicycle touring that you are getting into. Of course, I've talked about the tour recently by the folks who were doing the Underground Railroad ride. I know that there's other folks that are kind of exploring Black history in that way. This route, one of the folks in the documentary actually had recreated this ride back in the 1970s as well. In fact, pre-Bike Centennial in 1974, which I thought was fascinating that was done. So really interesting stuff. I think it's something, food for thought, good way to celebrate Black History Month with a bicycle touring twist to consume some of these things. All right. So that is the end of the Odds and Ends Pannier episode. Thanks so much for all of you who have been writing and interacting throughout the entire pandemic in particular. With less bike touring content to be able to share with you, it's nice to see, it's edifying to see that what I'm doing on the show is resonating and that you're getting something out of all of this. Because like I say, time and time again, if it weren't for the fact that those of you who are listening were enjoying this, I don't think I would bother doing the show. Because, if I'm doing something and just talking into the ether, what's the point? But it does seem like that this has been helpful for a lot of folks out there. And that makes me feel really, really good. I am excited, however, that, and I'll just, tell a personal side of it. My parents are getting vaccinated next week, their second vaccination, in fact. And, that to me lets me breathe a sigh of relief about COVID is around. We need to be mindful of it. It's going to be with us for at least probably the next several months, but the possibility of vaccinations getting us to a point where we might be able to relax a little bit and we might be able to get a little bit more of our lives back from a travel perspective. That's exciting, and that's also really great from a bike touring perspective. So my hope is that I'm going to this year be able to bring you some more and more interesting bike touring content beyond just the C&O, which seemed to dominate so much of what I was doing in this past year. But don't worry, C&O heads. I will absolutely do a C&O ride or 2 or maybe 3, and I will definitely be sharing that here. But I am looking forward to breaking out of the region a little bit, and maybe doing that ride to New York, maybe getting out to the West Coast again. And my optimism level has been ticked up just a little bit more because of the good news, at least in my family. So I hope that for those of you who have older family members, or you yourself are fitting into that age bracket, you're getting out there and getting those vaccines and getting yourself in a better place with all of this, so that maybe finally we can put all of this in the rear view and get out and ride. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Avilas Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Dan Gebhardt, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhart Bigl, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, Don Funk, Tom Bilch, Ronald Piroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lecko, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCulloch, John Hickman, Jack Smith, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Dave Fletcher, James Stratakis, David Neves, Mike Lazewski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, and Scott Angelo, Chad Reno, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make the show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.